in Moscow and Kiev and Minsk, and finding interesting bits and collecting that stuff and putting it to one side, but not ultimately doing much with it until this kind invitation from Mike. And I thought I'll try and turn this into something a bit more substantial. I don't know what yet. So this is by no means a kind of a finished article. It's not quite half-baked, I'd suggest. But there might be an article in it eventually. So the title tells you I'm talking about youth construction, but really I'm being slightly more niche than that. I'm going to talk about student construction brigades that start in 1959 and go on through to 1989. And I'm mostly approaching this today in a kind of, in the spirit of this particular workshop, in a from above perspective. So I'm not really looking at the kind of experiences and motivations of people that will probably follow later on. This is more kind of what the authorities have broadly understood, what they get out of all this. There are a few things that I'd kind of ask advice on if anyone is feeling solicitous. Firstly, any kind of interesting first-hand sort of memoir material that crops up of, you know, accounts from anyone's youth. I found bits and pieces on this, but equally they're mostly drawn from the kind of Komsomol nostalgia websites. They're problematic in some ways. So if anyone has suggestions about kind of places to find the experience, that would be good. Also, any thoughts anyone has on connections to draw to previous periods? Obviously, this is not the start of Komsomol volunteering and construction, not even close to it. But within the documents, we do see sometimes 1954 in the Virgin Lands, but more typically 1959, we do see this presented, framed as the birth of something new, that this is, while we can look back to Magnitogorsk and so on, and the metro construction, and all kinds of other things as sort of precursors or distant ancestors, there is nonetheless in the Komsomol literature a sense that this is something discrete and, you know, a new something. So I'd be interested any ideas anyone has about connections to earlier examples of this kind of activity. Similarly, student construction is back in a big way since the early 2000s. This is a monument which is now up outside MGU. I think it went up 2019, I could be wrong. Every time the year ends in a 9, there's a big, you know, celebration at the Kremlin, and all the veterans are wheeled out and so on and so forth. And they're held up as shining examples to today's youth in Russia and so on. So anyone who watches the kind of contemporary Russian scene closer than I do, I'd be interested if you see any connections with all this. So what I want to do then basically is give you all a sense of the kind of scale and dimensions of this sort of activity, and then offer a few kind of broad umbrella kind of ways of thinking about this to try and give you some of my thoughts on what this tells us, what we can understand by looking at this stuff. So, well, I've got a slight pause. I might move on to another slide because I thought they would go from one to the next and they don't. So, as I mentioned, there have been kind of public calls to mobilize youth volunteers from all kinds of stages. Certainly under Khrushchev, we see these about getting youth to go out to Siberia and so on. This is part of the picture, but I'm looking at something slightly narrower here. The basic picture to give you with these student construction brigades is one of tremendous growth and really quite a substantial theme. So what we see in 1959, actually I'll start the year before, 1958, this is the kind of an idea that a group from MGU take up once they've been out to the Virgin Lands. They've kind of bought into the, I guess, romanticism of it, but they've also seen the shambolic nature of much of it as well. And they've thought we can do something better here. This is in the official kind of accounts of this, not the Soviet official accounts. So 1959, 339 students from MGU go out to northern Kazakhstan and build 20 objects, a few houses, pigsty, chicken run, that kind of thing. 1961, it's climbed up to 1,260 participants building 110 objects. They're mostly going from Moscow and Leningrad at this stage. 1962, there's a Sovmin decree in support of this new youth initiative, and it starts to grow quickly. By 1964, we're up to 25,000 participants, 3,220 objects. Then when we cross over into the Brezhnev period, the growth becomes even more rapid. So 1965, 40,000 people involved. 1967, an interesting point is reached when they create, up to this point, it seems it's very much more kind of initiative from below based. And then in 1967, it seems like somebody kind of gets hold of this from above and starts to organize and systematize everything. They create an all union board, a stab, to kind of organize and fix up the workload and so on. Then by 1968, we passed 250,000 participants. By 1972, it's 500,000 participants. Supposedly in 1973, they do $1 billion rubles worth of work across the country. And by 1981, supposedly hit 2 billion rubles worth of work across the country. 1983 is the peak of this, 860,000 participants. I should say, by the way, on participant numbers, I'm not clear yet whether this is different people each time or whether actually what we're getting is multiple counting, because people do this for several years in a row sometimes. So it might be that the numbers are to some extent misleading. And then 1989, this kind of chronological end of things I've not looked at yet. But 1989, it drops really sharply down to 300,000 and then wound down. And then, as we know, it's kind of back now. So the overall picture we have is 14.5 million people. Again, this is with the qualification about the double counting, treble counting, whatever. So this is a massive feature of life for a huge number of people. And detachments, apparently, according to the Komsomol materials, by the 1970s, they're doing as much building over 5 years as the Ministry of Construction is overseeing each year. So they're doing 20% the amount of work that the actual Ministry of Construction is overseeing, according to Komsomol materials. So the kinds of things they do. Sometimes this is short-term and used for kind of fast response. We see this with Tashkent, for example, with the earthquake. Within days, thousands of Komsomol members are mobilized in Kiev, in Moscow, and they're in Tashkent in under a week, as far as I can tell. And we see the same thing again after Chernobyl, where they're kind of putting up housing around the outside of Kiev. Again, this is, you know, a kind of a cohort which is mobile, which can kind of drop everything and be ushered off somewhere else. Perhaps there's a connection to earlier periods there, I suppose. But they also do the kind of big long-term infrastructure projects, which would perhaps be surprising, certainly would be surprising anywhere else. So they're involved in things like construction of the Moscow Ring Road, the Ostankino TV Tower, Akademgorodok, multiple hydroelectric plants and dams across Siberia, worryingly some atomic energy plants, 1980 Olympics infrastructure. This is really kind of really widespread. There's lots. Suzanne mentioned the Yamal Peninsula with the gas. They're involved up there, kind of creating places for the for gas workers to live and so on. They're throwing up kind of places to live, and later also doing pipelines. They're digging canals for irrigation in Turkmenistan, all this kind of stuff. Sports stadiums, youth clubs, cafes. So yeah, I mentioned power stations in Magadan, Estonia, Dagestan, Kyrgyzstan, all sorts of stuff. There's also then in 1969 a special two-year burst called Komsomol to the Rural School, which is basically building or else refurbishing huge numbers of rural schools around the country. So the figures I have, the first year, so this would be 1969, Western Siberia alone, they build 140 schools and refurbish a further 582. And this includes things like adding science labs and photography dark rooms and sports facilities and so on. Figures for the year after from Belarus talk about, this is just Belarusian student detachments, building 72 new schools, refurbishing more than 200. The last thing on the sort of outline dimensions I'll mention, they also do exchanges with other parts of the socialist bloc. We get youth coming in from Czechoslovakia Hungary, GDR, and Soviet youth going there. This is a much more kind of substantial part of the work. But we also see some other foreign students from the developing world who are studying in the Soviet Union. They're also packed off to construction sites during the summer, probably to keep them out of trouble, I suppose. But we also see cases in which these construction detachments are sent abroad, so to help develop gas industry in Algeria, for example. There are records of kind of, I presume this is a kind of a gifting to improve ties and so on. So this is a really kind of sprawling field of activity that touches all sorts of different areas. And I just wanted to run over a few of these to give you some thoughts on where I think this is useful in some way. So Ben Tromley has mentioned this stuff already, relatively briefly, and he sees this primarily as, I think it's fair to say, an attempt by Khrushchev to kind of reforge the student body, that Khrushchev sees Soviet students, certainly at the kind of elite universities, as having become distant from Soviet reality to elitist and so on, and Tromley sees this as kind of Khrushchev bringing them back to the masses in lots of ways, to kind of forge them in this, the school of life is the term that gets used all the time. There's something in that, but I also want to expand on this stuff as well. It's a very Khrushchev thing, obviously, kind of, but the interesting thing, of course, is that what we know about Khrushchev campaigns are that they tend to be massive in scale. And this only really gets massive later, which is kind of striking in some ways. The first thing I will talk about in this context then is economic issues going on. And I guess the kind of headline point here is that the Komsomol across the post-Stalin period is becoming increasingly, I guess, business-minded. It's not just about kind of forging youth ideologically and so on. This isn't a completely new claim to be making, but this is a kind of expansion on that. Increasingly, we're seeing they're interested in making money, primarily for youth development, not that they're enriching themselves, but they are interested in all these kinds of areas. So one thing then is this cheap labor? Is this, we see, for example, the decline of gulag labor, of this kind of semi-free labor, I suppose. Is this a sort of a substitution for the kind of labor resources that the regime previously had? In some ways, yes, but this is not really especially cheap labor that the regime is getting its hands on. Certainly across the years, the pay for this goes up and up, to the point that people are actually, some people are kind of pressured into going, but some people kind of compete to go as well. It's really quite a mixed picture on this front. You can earn good money over a summer, more than you could earn legally in other ways doing this kind of work. Putin, for example, in that, was it called First Person, this memoir that he did, he talked about earning a fantastic amount of money doing summer construction work in the 70s. So this is something that kind of taps into the wider sort of, I guess, consumerism sort of literature on the age of young people getting access to money. But in terms of whether this is a sort of a rich source of cheap labor, the literature on these movements in Yugoslavia says in the 50s they get suspended for a good while because they lose money. They cost more money than they actually save or make. Transporting young people to the other end of the country, feeding them, etc., is really not any cheaper than hiring local labor. Which brings me to a different point, that this is probably more about labor supply than about cheap labor. We know, obviously, the Soviet regime has a problem with not having enough workers at various stages, certainly in some fields and certainly in some places. And these tend to be the fields that we're talking about, often construction. There's continually material in the press around the late 50s and early 60s about the lack of kind of qualified builders of all sorts of different building trades and so on. Presumably this is related to, you know, personnel being sucked into the massive housing drive, and therefore other stuff is, you know, is being left, as it were. So yeah, I don't think this is so much about cheap labor as I think it is about labor supply, that the Komsomol is kind of building some kind of leverage for itself as a broker in labor, that what lots of parts of the Soviet system need is more labor, and the Komsomol kind of has this stuff on tap as its membership is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We see in the 70s lots of telegrams, letters, and so on from different ministries asking, can you send us 10,000 people to this project? Can you send us 5,000? Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. But it's quite clear that there are ministries competing or kind of fighting one another almost to get their hands on this labor. The big picture on the economy, though, to mention is that obviously what we're seeing here is a kind of a continuation of extensive growth rather than intensive growth. This is sort of presented as a powerful, decisive new force in the Soviet economy, and it's no such thing. We see all the problems of the Soviet economy replicated here, and sometimes it's worse. So problems around productivity and safety and bottlenecks, all this stuff is still there, and it's worse in many ways. These are people who are, generally speaking, unqualified. They're enthusiastic. You know, there's a reason the University of Glasgow doesn't have enthusiastic history students outside on the scaffolding. It's not the way forwards. So there's also a social cohesion element to this as well. And this is something I was thinking about more based on an initial reading of some of the literature about Yugoslavia. There are different directions we can take this. One is about nationalities questions. The Yugoslav example, the literature talks about really soon after the war, they start dispatching Serbs to Croatia and Croats to Bosnia and so on as a way to kind of start interacting, start sort of creating social adhesion, I think is a term that the literature uses there. And there are hints of this, at least in the kind of propaganda rhetoric about these brigades. There's talk of kind of gifting of Ukrainians, kind of gifting their labor to the people of Tashkent as they're fixing the country. There's talk about the kind of this as a manifestation of the Soviet family looking after each other and so on. There's clearly an element to which this is about trying to rhetorically at least bind different nationalities together. The evidence is far from conclusive on this, but there certainly are cases where that obviously does not work, where we see, for example, KGB reports which talk of Estonians refusing to talk to Russians on construction sites when they're there for months and they won't even talk to each other, or of Chechens getting in fights with locals and so on in Altai and all this kind of stuff. There, presumably there are some, you know, long-term friendships formed and so on, but there are also problems as well. I would suggest it's hit and miss at best. We can also think about cohesion, though, in an urban-rural context as well. So firstly, this, again, about kind of rural uplift, about basically city kids coming to help out in rural areas. Because they don't just build as well lots of these detachments. One of the key things that they do, basically at the end of the working day, they're expected to put on concerts and football matches and so on and so forth. So this isn't simply about kind of physical building, it's also giving talks, and some of the ones which have doctors and so on give basic medical care and advice on hygiene and so on. So these are parts of the country which are not being served by, I guess, the system proper in terms of, you know, provided by ministries and so on and so forth. And so we see the Komsomol kind of plugging lots of important gaps in this sense, which obviously covers over a whole range of problems. And again, there's just this sense of kind of interaction of, you know, this sort of picture we have of rural communities being, if not sealed off, at least suspicious of the sort of city types and so on. And the city types obviously kind of looking down on you know, rural bumpkins and this kind of thing. So I think there is also something in there. Again, we see this talk of gifting at times of Moscow Komsomol, for example, talking about building schools and roads as being a kind of a jubilee gift to rural peoples in '67 and so on. which strikes me as interesting in all kinds of ways. Lastly, the final piece of context I'll mention that I'm thinking about, but I really am kind of fumbling around a bit here, is where this ties in with what we know more generally about the picture with youth and the Komsomol and students more specifically. We know certainly by 56, 57, by the end of 56, in the context of Hungary, there is a real kind of a wave of articles criticizing bourgeois behavior among university students and all this kind of thing. This clearly is, to some degree, about sort of reforging the country's students. I don't think it continues in that vein forever. I think there is obviously a point, which is where the growth kind of feeds back into this, at which point this, someone says, hey, we're onto a good thing in some context here, the stuff I've just been talking about, picking which of those is key. So it seems that there is an expectation that this will do some good, but I don't really see that as the kind of the primary driver as we move on. Occupying student time. I think this is probably more important than we maybe realize. This, I guess, brings us to something that that Gleb Tsipursky has talked about with his book Socialist Fun, which is one of the things that the regime is doing. They're obviously wary of hooliganism, of sort of westernization of youth culture and so on. So giving people sort of wholesome alternatives, whether it's photography clubs or whether it's martial arts or whatever. And this definitely fits into that picture. Bundle, hundreds of thousands of students off to, construction sites in Siberia for the summer. This seems to me to fit really nicely in there. And in the process, they're also building infrastructure for youth. So palaces of youth, sports facilities, and so on. So there's a kind of a double win in that sense. Am I just about done?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I apologize. Okay, then we'll finish that. That's okay. Oh yeah, sorry. And Thomas, have I just trodden on the lead? Hopefully not. Oh shit, sorry. Oh, he's coming.
It's all right, nothing's gone wrong really yet. So,
it's the tangle of kind of extended wires that I think I.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry.
Maybe it's also the oh no.
Yes.
Okay.
Are you just going to sit?
Wherever.
Yes, please have a seat.
So we're joined now by Tomas Sniegon. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Whatever. Yes, Sniegon.
You've got a whole. You see?
Okay.
Sorry, I meant to give it earlier.
That's all right. So we have now Tomas Sniegon from the University of Lund. Coup d'etat, Komsomol style, a new look at the conflict between political generations. Dr. Sniegon holds a PhD in history, associate professor in European studies at Lund University in Sweden. In his early career as a journalist, he worked with Vladimir Senichastny, the KGB chairman from 1961 to 1967, on Senichastny's memoirs. This book was published in Czech in 1998 under the title Third Floor of the Lubyanka, and later illegally in Russia under the title Nebespokojnie Serce.
Bespokojne serce.
Bespokojnie Serce. Tomas is currently finalizing a new book in Senichastny based on analysis of their joint interviews from the 1990s and a comparison of this testimony with the archival materials already made available.
Yes. Great pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. My talk will be a case study, pretty boring because it's about an event that never happened. Immediately after Leonid Brezhnev took the lead in October 1964 instead of Nikita Khrushchev, rumors began to appear that Brezhnev could only be a temporary figure, that he could be ousted in the foreseeable future. However, their specific manifestations are impossible to trace, given that they could not be recorded anywhere publicly or officially. More details began to emerge over the years thanks to various memoir publications, the first of which, published during the Cold War, belonged to prominent Soviet dissidents. Brezhnev's assumed successor, Alexander Shelyepin, was to head the group to prepare for the overthrow followed by the acting KGB chairman Vladimir Semichastny. As both were former Komsomol leaders and representatives of the young generation of Soviet politicians, the episode became known as preparations for the so-called Komsomol coup. In addition, Shelepin was also a former KGB chairman from 1958 to 1961, Semichastny's immediate predecessor. In 1964 and 1965, he led a very powerful party and state control committee that could control and compromise party and state officials. A complete list of alleged members of the Komsomol group has never been presented. Historical significance of this event remains marginal, mainly because the coup never happened and Brezhnev ruled until his death in 1982. Probably because of this, and also because of the great lack of specific original sources, it remains insufficiently examined. Nevertheless, claims about the failed Komsomol coup are repeated to this day, even in the works of some renowned historians. On the other hand, rumors of a coup against Brezhnev in the mid-1960s meant that for the first time in Soviet history, not only one, but two KGB chairmen were suspected of plotting to overthrow the party highest leader. Not even Beria was accused of planning to overthrow the leader who was still alive, but only of wanting to abuse his position in the security forces in a power struggle after Stalin's death. Moreover, it was the first time that the past and the incumbent KGB chairman together should have wanted to overthrow not only one, but two top Soviet leaders in a row. Last but not least, the first years of Brezhnev's rule were exceptional also due to the fact that not only one, but two Soviet highest-ranking leaders were living in the Soviet capital Moscow at an active age, the former one, Khrushchev, and the current one, Brezhnev. Brezhnev, unlike his predecessor, Khrushchev, was not replaced because of Khrushchev, unlike his predecessor, unlike his predecessor, Khrushchev was not replaced because of his poor physical or mental health, or because of his death. This made the situation different from the years 1922 to 24, when Stalin came to power and Lenin was already dying, or from 1953, when the position became vacant only after Stalin's death. The unprecedented situation in the middle of the 1960s meant that Khrushchev, at least theoretically, was still able to polarize the party. Thus, Brezhnev must have experienced a special kind of uncertainty, being potentially vulnerable from his position in the middle of the younger and older political generation. A critical study of the Komsomol coup is therefore not important from the personal point of view of the accused personalities, but mainly due to other reasons. First, a deeper clarification of the possibilities, practices, and position of the KGB in the entire post-Stalinist system and the nature of this system in general. The relevance of research of relations between the head of state and the secret services has increased in recent years, when Russian President Putin has sharply increased the role of politically dominated state security in Russian society. Second, speculations about a Komsomol coup are important because of their implications for Soviet society. The removal of Shelepin and Semichastny from power for a long time practically stopped the generational changes within the Soviet leadership, which led to both an absurd series of state funerals in the Red Square in the early 1980s and the need to replace the extinct old guard with the inexperienced and much younger Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. In his biographical book, published in the mid-1970s after his expulsion from the Soviet Union, Alexander Solzhenitsyn claimed that the Shelepin clan was preparing a coup against Khrushchev's successor in 1965, but lost his battle in August of that year. However, this prominent Soviet dissident did not elaborate on exactly why Shelepin should have tried to seize power just 10 months after Nikita Khrushchev was overthrown. Another dissident claim published before Gorbachev's perestroika was Joris Medvedev's book on Semichastny's successor, Yuri Andropov, published in the West in 1983. A year before its publication, Andropov replaced Brezhnev as the CPSU General Secretary, and Medvedev's book was one of the very first biographies of Andropov. The author, who was also expelled from the USSR in 1973, went even farther in describing Shelepin's ambitions, arguing that already the coup against Khrushchev was de facto organized by Shelepin and Suslov, while Brezhnev was not directly involved. Medvedev added that in the fall of 1965, the time had come to make the transitional decision of 1964 permanent, and this gave rise to a new battle for power in the Soviet leadership. However, Medvedev referred only to unspecified speculation from Moscow and did not explain why Brezhnev was to remain in the shadow of Shelepin and Suslov in 1964 and still stand at the top, while and why Shelepin and Suslov had to wait another year to complete their transitional plans. Medvedev came to the following conclusion. Suslov was associated with the possibility of reintroducing Stalinist practices, but although Shelepin was known as an anti-Stalinist, it was clear that he also had ambitions to become the new great leader. Both of these proved that even these people and dissidents who were publishing freely in the West saw Brezhnev as a lesser evil compared to Shelepin. The third dissident, Roy Medvedev, saw it similarly in his short political biography of Brezhnev, one of the first published within the USSR after the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Soviet era, at a time when Semichastny had spoken publicly about his controversial encounter with Brezhnev and Brezhnev's speculations that Khrushchev could have been physically abolished before October 1964, new allegations emerged about his and Shelepin's hunger for power. Fyodor Burlatsky, one of Brezhnev's and Andropov's former advisors, did not directly take part in the power struggle at the top party leadership in 1964 to 67, but he acted as someone who summed up the views of people from Brezhnev and Andropov. Another former Brezhnev advisor, Georgy Arbatov, even insisted that Shelepin had already formed his own shadow government and shadow party presidency. Andrei Alexandrov Agentov, Brezhnev's former foreign policy advisor, added in his memoirs that Shelepin was in fact a Stalinist seeking a return, while Brezhnev seemed to have de facto saved the party from such developments, thus ensuring the continuation of Khrushchev's reforms. The controversy over the alleged Komsomol coup was thus found itself at the heart of the domestic political disputes between three groups of actors. The first group, the dissidents, criticized Shelepin and Semichastny for being chairmen of the brutal Soviet political police, which means that they were ambitious hardliners and masters of conspiracy. The second group, to which Shelepin and Semichastny themselves belonged, had lost the struggle for power to Brezhnev. They denied their own political ambitions and blamed Brezhnev for his inability to lead the country. They also saw Brezhnev as the main culprit of the corrupt period of stagnation that, in the end, led to the final dissolution of the Soviet Union. When they soon after the October plenum in 1964 realized that Brezhnev was not the leader that he had promised to be, they started to object to some of his decisions. The third group, finally, consisted of advisors that aid of Brezhnev and Andropov, and aides of Brezhnev and Andropov, sorry. They defended Brezhnev and Andropov and attacked Shelepin and Semichastny. At the same time, they tried to exclude Andropov from the negative context of the stagnation period by presenting him as a reformer and political father of Mikhail Gorbachev and his perestroika. The memoirs by members of this group, who under the perestroika were given a reputation of being progressive, were influenced by images of the extraordinarily ambitious Shelepin and the provisory Brezhnev, who defended himself from Shelepin's ambitions. This was also the case of Western historiography. Western historians, however, were more hesitant in their interpretations of the Komsomol coup than some of their Russian colleagues. In other words, the meaning of the narrative divides and polarizes the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party in the mid-1960s in three ways. It stresses the differences between the personalities of Leonid Brezhnev and Alexander Shelepin. It displays clear borders between two political generations. And last but not least, it puts the Communist Party and the KGB in a different light. In all these contexts, Shelepin, Semichastny, and their allies are portrayed negatively as the people who caused the conflict. Brezhnev and his supporters, on the other hand, are portrayed as merely defending themselves as victims of conspirational plans carried out by their younger challengers. According to the same logic, Brezhnev and the older generation allegedly only defended themselves as the party from the young conspirators and returned to Stalinism, and thus de facto insisted on maintaining law and order. The stress had always been on the differences between these groups rather than the similarities. There are practically only two testimonies from those who could be considered more consecrated than Alexandrov, Agentov, Arbatov, and Burlatsky. The posthumous, unauthorized memoirs of Anastas Mikoyan and the authorized editions of the diaries of the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party and the member of CPSU Central Committee and Politburo Pyotr Shelest. Shelest did not agree that Shelepin was central figure in the overthrow of Khrushchev, not that Shelepin and Semichastny were preparing to take over in 1965. In addition, according to him, Brezhnev and Shelepin were still maintaining friendly relations at the time. Shelest also rejected the idea of a Komsomol coup in an interview with the press in 1991. Mikoyan, on the other hand, was much more critical of Shelepin and his group. In his book, according to Mikoyan, Shelepin was actually preparing to overthrow Brezhnev. What is surprising in the text, however, is the date of these alleged preparations. The Shelepin group, he did not name specific companies, was to approach Mikoyan in the spring of 1967 through his son and ask whether Anastas Mikoyan would be willing to stand up to Brezhnev with them on the Central Committee, with most members of the Central Committee who already should be critical of leader Brezhnev. However, the logic of this statement remains unclear. In 1967, it was already after the 24th Party Congress, at which in 1966, Brezhnev significantly strengthened his political position. And Anastas Mikoyan had not been member of the party's Politburo since 1966. So his political power was slim at that time. There is another reason to doubt Mikoyan's testimony. It was not published until 1999, 21 years after the politician's death, and the notes that served as the basis for the book in question do not suggest that the testimony was truly authentic. The notes were kept in the Russian State Archive of Social and Political History, the GASPI, and there is no mention of a meeting of Anastas Mikoyan with a representative of the Shelepin group in the spring of 1967. This makes Mikoyan's book unreliable in that regard. Of course, there are other aspects necessary for a detailed analysis of this period, such as the way in which Brezhnev enforced the amendments of the statutes at the 23rd Congress of the Communist Party in 1966 and lifted the term limits for senior officials. There is no room for them today. However, a study of the given transfer of power, paradoxically still the most democratic in the history of the Soviet dictatorship, leads me to the conclusion that instead of facing a real Komsomol coup, Brezhnev immediately after the dismissal of his predecessor, Nikita Khrushchev, managed to reject the idea of collective leadership that had earlier secured him political support against Khrushchev and consolidate his own personal dominance by establishing full control over the Soviet political police, KGB, and institutions that had the potential to limit his own political power. After 1967, there were no ambitious Komsomol leaders left in the most influential positions. Nevertheless, some fear of a conflict between generations was still visible before the following 24th Congress of CPSU. For example, in 1970, a year before the Congress, the frequency of orders, discussions, and calls concerning the differences between the younger and older generations within the KGB was surprising. There were also new recommendations for work with young cadres in the KGB veterans, and the KGB veterans even issued a declaration to their younger successors. They urged all young Chekists to always remain disciplined, faithful, with limitless dedication to the Communist Party and the great project of communism. After the 24th Party Congress, Semichastny was removed from the Central Committee of the CPSU. Shelepin remained a member of the Politburo until 1975, but stripped of his previous power and influence. The analysis of the Komsomol narrative discloses that its narrators are not able to agree on an exact time or any specific reasons for the alleged coup, whether they date such an attempt to October 1964, the autumn of 1965, or the early 1967. While defending Leonid Brezhnev, they have never suggested any possible situation at which Shelepin would have been able to convince other top Soviet leaders that Brezhnev was about to fall, similar to Khrushchev. There was neither any mention of influential allies at the party leadership outside the Komsomol group, nor any allies in armed forces. As soon as Leonid Brezhnev came to power, he was able to use speculation about possible preparation for a new state coup against himself and showed the ambitious and relatively naive Komsomol group and the rest of the world that the Soviet political system would continue to depend on the leader and not the other way around. It was just this period, however, that laid the foundation for the long period of rule of his ideologically close favorites belonging to the same generation, who could be separated from power by practically only death. At the same time, it was not until 1985, 68 years after the October Revolution, that the Soviet Union was able to see for the first time a leader born during the Soviet era and not pre-revolutionary Russia. Due to the due to the resemblance to today's system in post-Soviet Russia and the fact that Brezhnev's era is seen again as a period of stability rather than gradual collapse, it is unfortunately still important to think more deeply about these issues of transfer of supreme power. Thank you.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, sorry for the drama. I have great pleasure to introduce Natalya Chernyshova and her paper, The Politics of Modernization in Late Soviet Belarus. Natalya is a senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Winchester in the UK. She has published extensively on late Soviet and Belarusian history, including her first book in 2007, I think the best title ever, Shopping with Brezhnev, Soviet Urban Consumer Culture.
I wish it
were. She's currently writing a physical biography of Pyotr Masharov, the first secretary of the Belarusian Communist Party between 1965 and 1980, and this project is funded by a British Academy mid-career fellowship.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, Mike, and David, for having me here and inviting me to this really wonderful conference. And congratulations to all of you to making it to the last paper of the day. I'll keep it short and sweet, I promise. So when historians talk about Soviet Belarus, which isn't often, they even more rarely linger on the long 1970s, the years when Pyotr Masharov served as the first secretary of the Belarusian Communist Party. This is between 1965 to 1980, so broadly overlapping almost exactly with Brezhnev's years in power. When scholars do look at that period, the conversation tends to turn to Russification, repression, and the loss of ethnic identity, which to my view isn't entirely accurate. But more recently, scholars have focused also on another aspect of importance in this period, and that's war memory of the Second World War, which was of course part of the broader Brezhnev era cult of the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union, but in Belarus had particular resonance for all kinds of reasons. And the focus on this permeating war, public war memory, served to, on the one hand, to cement the republic in the Soviet fold, but also formed a powerful core of Belarusian national identity that has survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I've argued elsewhere has even contributed, had an important or unexpected role in the 2020 protests in Belarus. But in this paper, I would like to focus, and this paper is part of my larger project on Soviet Belarus under Masharov. I'd like to draw attention to another constituent of domestic political discourse in Belarus, which often gets overshadowed by war memory and sometimes completely ignored, and that is economic modernization. Now, Belarus saw a spectacular industrialization leap in, importantly, not during the 1930s, like a lot of the industrialized part of the Soviet Union, but in the 2 decades after the war. So a very, specific, quite late period. That's when the investment flowed in from the center. This is when capital construction of large-scale projects was launched and developed. And to just give you a sense of how different that period was from the 1930s, Belarus received capital funds in the first 5 years of post-war period, the first 5 years after the war, it received more capital funds than it had received in all of the 5-year periods before the war, all taken together. And the investments like this began to bear fruit precisely in the Masharov era. So the Masharov government was able to capitalize on this substantially. Just again, to give you one example that sort of links up with Suzanne's paper, Belarus became an oil extracting republic. In 1965, it started its regular supplies of pumping oil into the Druzhba pipeline for the first time and onwards. By 1968, the republic was extracting 1.7 millions of tons of oil every in that year, and 9 million tons of gas, natural gas. This might not seem very much, but this was a double over the previous year. So the growth is quite spectacular. And this became an important basis and wasn't seen so much as a kind of future fuel alternative or option, but this was seen as an important basis for a new type of chemical industry, chemistry research, new chemical production, which had been virtually non-existent in the 1930s. This meant that all chemical giants of Belarus were built, completed by the 1960s in the post-war period, and a lot of them were launched in the mid-1960s in terms of their operation. So by the end of the 1960s, Belarus was built to become one of the producers, one of the main producers in the country of petrochemical synthetic fibers, for example. So this kind of cutting edge industry, and Belarus was presented in the press as the place for it. And this is one of the image that I was able to find of the Rechitsa Neft oil wells in Belarus, which began pumping into the Druzhba pipeline in 1965. So under Masharov, the expansion and modernization of industry in Belarus were seen as key political priorities. and public discourse that placed emphasis on this expansion, on rapid progress, emphasis on the word rapid, on expansion, and achievements was just as prominent as the commemoration of the war. In the long 1970s, the politics of modernization in Belarus became the centerpiece of Soviet power legitimacy, but also, I would say, the centerpiece of national identity building. That was specifically Belarusian, but that nation building, so that identity was infused with very strong civic elements, which sometimes leads to conclusion that Belarus didn't have national identity, but I'm arguing it wasn't the case. So the modernization discourse was especially prominent around, as you would expect, high points of sort of political celebrations, such as the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the BSSR, which was officially commemorated, officially marked as the 1st of January of 1969, the 50th anniversary of the declaration of the Belarusian Soviet Republic and Belarusian Communist Party. And you see a lot of this kind of discourse about modernization around that time in the press, on TV, the new documentaries being made about Belarus and its kind of growth with the emphasis on modernity. There are exhibitions, the Belarusian VDNH, the exhibition of national economy achievements, opens up in Minsk its own VDNH, timed for this 50th commemoration of the setup of the BSSR. Public speeches by political leaders reflect that discourse as well. And the main trope, the main message of the discourse is this previously backward region transformed into a flourishing republic, which is now equal among equals in the great family of the fraternal peoples of the USSR. And the emphasis on Belarus before the revolution is always as bastard, downtrodden, stuck in the marshes, poverty-stricken margins of the Tsarist Empire. And this contrasts with the flourishing Soviet Republic. And why is it flourishing? In what way is it flourishing? The evidence inevitably comes from the industry. It's not agriculture, it's industry. And this is how, for example, Piotr Masherev, the first secretary, presents this image, or elaborates on this image in a celebratory session that was dedicated to the 50th anniversary of the Belarusian Republic on 28th of December of 1968, so 3 days before the official commemoration. And he said, a land where wooden plows and hoes were only relatively recently handed over to museums, now supplies domestic and foreign markets with tractors and harvesting combines, automobiles and computers, automated production lines and complex machines, radio equipment and petrochemicals. Descendants of farmers who told the time by the sun now make first-rate watches. Switzerland, watch out. Granddaughters of peasant women who for centuries used a primitive spinning wheel and handloom now produce nearly 480,000 square meters of fabric per day at textile factories and enterprise. So notice how this is all about peasants into workers, right? However, though these messages are particularly, omnipresent around the high celebration points, they are not just limited to those few occasions. They are pretty much a rhetorical constant in Belarus. For instance, there's another article in the newspaper called Sovetskaya Belarusia, which is like a Belarusian Pravda, if you like, the main party and state newspaper. And this article appeared in December 1969. And it's about how Belarus was represented as a republic at the Moscow VDNH, in Moscow, economic exhibition of achievements in national economy. And the reporter goes to VDNH with a specific mission to find how Belarus is represented there. And I think this article is a particularly good example how this story of modernization is the dominant narrative in the identity of the Republic. Again, Belarus is seen primarily as an industrial hub, And it makes a not so subtle hint, I'm sorry to say, Jeremy, that it is more advanced than the others. So, and again, this kind of hinting, there's no direct threat to Georgia, but there's this, kind of, here's the statistics, and, Belarus is. So this kind of, it's a recurrent trope. So I think, you're onto something there about competition a bit. But the observations that the journalist makes are quite revealing. So he says at some point, the BSSR is a republic of machine building. That's what defines it, right? And it produces every 5th tractor, every 8th machine, every 13th television and radio set in the Soviet Union. Then he goes to see a film that's on offer about Belarus, and he describes the film. And the description goes like this: Minsk, the Victory Square, so urban setting, the automobile plant, the tractor plant. Yet another vehicle is leaving the assembly line, smiling face of a tractor driver, fields of golden wheat that stretch into the horizon. In this article, all the reporter does is he talks about factories and cities of Belarus that are represented at the VDNH. He talks about how he goes to a kind of a union-wide thematic exhibits, and he fully expects to see representatives of Belarusian industry there. And he does. And of course, they're there and represents the best of the best products of Soviet industry. The largest share of Belarusian products in this VDNH exhibit, he says, are to do with machine building. They are all assembled in the machine building pavilion. So again, another hint, this is what marks Belarus. It's machine production. And he also notes that this is quite significant and links this to the legitimacy of Soviet power by saying that before Soviet power, Belarus did not have a single machine factory, single equipment factory. And yet today our republic is one of the main battlefields, has to be a battlefield, of technical progress in the country. And again, it's not just about industrialization, but it's about this kind of advanced modern industries. And the fruits of these achievements, of these victories of this battlefield, can be seen again in pavilions with very revealing, telling names: electrical equipment, electrification, computers, radio electronic technologies, nuclear energy, and transportation. Now, the article, and that struck me at the time, but the article is almost entirely on industry. Agriculture gets one sentence in the whole feature piece, and this is a front page article in a main newspaper. And this I found is fairly typical. Farming is not ignored. Belarus does have some impressive achievements there. And in fact, you could say that they're just as impressive as the growth of industry. But the tone is a lot less bombastic, a lot less confident. The tone is more along the lines, well, yes, we've done some great things with our agriculture, but we really have a lot more to work on, and this is what needs to be done. Sometimes there's a sense that, well, yes, the great things that happened in agriculture are there because of industrial progress that we've made elsewhere, and that had a knock-on effect on agriculture. Whereas the industry is almost entirely a relentless success story. Very little criticism or all wrapped up in this story of success. Now, of course, the idea of Soviet power as vehicle of modernity is nothing new. Soviet socialism, I don't have to tell you, was always about industrialization. But it is very new for Belarus. And its industrial achievements are all in the now, in the here and now, are very new. And they're made and presented as being even more impressive, given that only recently it suffered apocalyptic destruction of infrastructure in the Second World War. So that is also brought in as another reason for the kind of this economic wonder. But more importantly, I think in the case of Belarus, this transformation is more than just a passage from rags to riches, from backwardness to modernity. It's also a national rite of passage. It's about moving from, this trope that's being used quite a lot, nameless territory, nameless backwaters of the Russian Empire, to a nation, a modern, developed nation. And this, I think, brings Belarus close to Tajikistan and Central Asia more broadly at around this time, where, as we know from Artemy Kalinovsky's excellent book, The Laboratory of Social Development, large-scale modernization projects of economic development also sprang up mainly during the 1960s and onwards up to the 1980s, and they were also linked there to national development with emphasis on national. One difference in Belarus, I think, is that its particular version of modernization aligns so closely to Brezhnev's concept of developed socialism. And as I'm sure you know very well, even without me telling you, the function of developed socialism as a concept was to explain what was principally new about the 1970s, the long 1970s, the Brezhnev era, why this constituted a more advanced stage of socialist development. And this was done by pointing to qualitatively new levels of modernization, new levels of economic modernization that were principally different. In other words, developed socialism was not just about quantitative expansion of industry, building more enormous factories, although there's always room for that. But that was the 1930s, really. That was the laying of the foundations. Now, developed socialism, as Brezhnev put it in 1977, in a very rare elaboration on that rather vague concept. Developed socialism was about perfecting socialism. It was about not just industry, but advanced industry, high quality, highly developed. It's about the economy that, I quote from his speech, rested on nuclear power, electronics, computers, transistors, and many other industries that in 1936 we did not possess. And that's precisely Belarus. And that's precisely how Belarus is presented. It's seen, it's portrayed as this industrial hub, the assembly line, that's all about the most modern top-notch industries, petrochemicals, electronics, synthetic fibers, all those exciting things, precision instruments, and giant trucks. And just to show you just an image of how, oh, this is completely blocked. Not sure what happened there, but the image is actually this one that didn't transfer very well, I'm sorry. But it's the offloading of giant Belarusian produced trucks, Belarus, obviously somewhere to a country in the Middle East, because people receiving these trucks are all dressed in traditional Middle Eastern garments. And the caption is an old man observes this scene and says, "So whom are you here to welcome?" And the port dock workers offloading these Belarusian giant trucks say, "We're here to greet the plenipotent representatives of Belarusia, Belarusia." And so it's all about automated, production processes, automated systems of managing whole industries, stuff of dreams and the future. And the emphasis is always on industry that's science-driven, and that matches the investments that come into various branches of sciences that, again, did not exist in Belarus as such in the 1930s or in the interwar period, and now they thrive. As another article put it, this is our leap in 50 years, from a hand plow to computers. And this kind of summarizes how Belarus is seen and presented. There's also talk of its involvement with nuclear energy. In the late 1960s, this is before civilian nuclear energy sector really takes off in the Soviet Union. The first civilian nuclear plants only begin to be built in the 1970s. Chernobyl hadn't been built yet, and Belarus is already kind of on this bandwagon of nuclear energy research. So it's very much a showcase, not just of Soviet modernity, but specifically of the Brezhnev era modernity. It's a flagship of developed socialism. And another important ingredient in this modernization politics of Belarus that sets it apart from the Stalin era industrialization is that it was paired up not with the terror and state violence, but with tangible improvements in living standards. And here again, the connection is made very explicit that all of this has a knock-on effect on people's lives, and comparisons are made, and specific examples are given. And again, sometimes it's openly indicated that Belarus is doing better than the other republics in terms of the living standards and how it's modernized and it's reaping these benefits of modernization on very basic daily level. So what was the outcome of all this, you might ask, and that's a very good question. These messages were repeated constantly, emphatically, in different shapes and forms, although never deviating too far from the set canon. And they were persuasive, I think, because Belarusians could look around and see the examples of these developments actually existing around them in very tangible ways. And of course, the rise in living standards in Belarus was also quite observable. And I think all of that has helped shape Belarusian national identity, which was not deprived of ethnic awareness, contrary to what has been sometimes said, but it just contains these really strong civic elements of identity. And this makes sense because ethnic markers are all very good, but they're constantly being connected and bound up in discourse, in public discourse, with poverty of the past, of the pre-revolutionary eras, the kind of background that we've tried and did so well to get away from into this modern age. Whereas the civic elements to do with modernity, urbanity, access to education and so on are all about the good life now. And so, it does make a difference. But I don't think it means that Belarus did not have a national identity, because these achievements, although they're presented within the Soviet context, and Belarusians are told in no uncertain terms that they have to be grateful to the wisdom and guidance of the Communist Party for that, and Soviet power and Lenin's ideas. But at the same time, the discourse does not deny people an agency in all of that. So, it's often presented as a conscious choice by the masses to embrace these ideas, these Leninist ideas, and to follow them and to implement them in life. So people, as in the people, narod, have an agency in this discourse, and this encourages national pride. So I think rather than negating Belarusian national identity, as was sometimes assumed, I'd argue that the politics of modernization helped strengthen it, but it fused it with strong civic elements, which I think had important implications for all kinds of things in Belarus, including a lot of its post-Soviet political decision-making at various points. And it remains, a factor in politics today. So thank you.
Questions already, but just that are should we like table service, so people help with food, but you can. Does it ask the questions?
Am I okay here? Do you want me to?
So I'll stay away from this end of things.
It doesn't matter now.
Don't
You
enough
can rip
damage.
it out.
It could ruin tomorrow, you never know.
I'm going to do a field of questions. I'll take 2 or 3 at a time, so it's plenty of questions. Pietro and
So I have actually questions for each one of you. You all did fantastic talks. I really enjoyed all 3 of them. Now the first one about these kind of workers' brigades, youth workers' brigades, is kind of interesting because I wrote my master's thesis about the Karabakh movement.
Okay.
In Armenia, and I was interviewing some of the leaders, and they were nostalgically remembering this period where they would go out to, I don't know, Krasnoyarsk or one of these places like in the Far East, and they would engage in these projects. My question to you, though, specifically is, did they take any kind of inspiration from like the 19th century Narodniki, this idea of going to the people, was that ever tied in to kind of, this movement, the history, going back to kind of going to the people? as for you, sir. So the interesting thing you were mentioning about Mikhayan, because again, I'm researching. I think that it is possible that Mikhayan could have been approached, although I don't have any evidence for this, and you have looked at Ergasky, the notes in Ergasky, so I would trust that as the ultimate source. But I talked to Vladimir Mikhayan, who is basically Sergo's son in Moscow, and he was saying that in those years of retirement, his grandfather had initially many kind of generous benefits that Khrushchev did not have in retirement, but that over the years Brezhnev would kind of wean them away. And there was also, I believe, in Mikhayan's memoirs, I'm using the Russian pronunciation, but also Armenian is Mikhayan. But there also was this narrative that Sergo presented, I think, like in the foreword, where there was one time that Brezhnev and Mikhayan were at the theater, and Mikhayan was recognized in the audience, and he got applause, and Brezhnev also got applause, but Mikhayan got louder applause, and so this Brezhnev kind of resented it. So there might have been some kind of tension there, but I'm not sure if that would be enough to substantiate this story that he would have been involved in any kind of coup. But this is an interesting thing. I think it's possible, but I cannot say that for sure. Now, as for Belarus, would you say, given all that wonderful evidence that you presented, that Belarus, in fact, would be the third republic? That would be my question to you.
That's a provocative
also,
question.
The other question, the other thing also I noticed, because this again connects with my Mikhayan research, that Mikhayan acted as kind of the lobbyist for Armenia in Moscow. And he also connected this whole idea of industrialization with development and also success in nationality policy. Now, I'm not sure if there's anything national about this or connected with nationality policy, but that was something else I noticed too, that not only is this kind of connected with the narrative of developed socialism, but also with demonstrating success in nationality policy. But a final question, was the war, and I think that this is kind of an obvious question, especially for a scholar who studies Belarus, was the war fused in as part of that rising Belarusian civic identity?
Okay. You can keep all that in mind. Natalia?
Starting with me, right?
No, sorry.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Before I forget.
Well, thank you for the papers. My question is actually to Natalya. You emphasize, modernization of industries and namely machine construction, nuclear power. Was this modernization a political decision, or was it driven by the ministries? Because these are priority branches, these are priority industries in the 60s and 70s.
Okay, thank you.
If you could answer those questions.
Yes.
Are you still working things out?
Sorry, just to make sure. So were they investing into the republic, or were they investing into the branches?
Okay.
So,
Well, you can
Natalia, are you happy to start first?
I'm happy to start first if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Before I forget them. So Pietro, thank you. Yeah, I'm not gonna get involved in comparisons, but obviously, yes, Belarus is the third. But more seriously, the success of nationality policies is an interesting use of the modernization successes, yet another use of it. And of course, that's part of legitimation of Soviet power. Why should these national republics be glad and grateful to be part of the Soviet Union? And this is it. But I think I'd be very interested to hear comparisons and your thoughts from other republics, because it seems to me that there is something particular about Belarus in the way it's presented, not as just as industrialization or modernity in very general sense, but with the focus on kind of science-driven cutting edge improvements that are very much post-war. And that does tie with your third question about the war as part of this. And yes, you know, the war makes this all even more impressive because the starting point is below zero. You know, it's not, Belarus didn't have very much industry in the 1930s. It had a little bit, but not anything to write home about. But the war raised even that. And so that they have to start from scratch. And this is folded in to the identity building process. And I think the way this is done is that the war memory, as the public memory of Belarusian sacrifices, it lost, you know, a lot of its population. What isn't being said that some of those losses were inflicted by the Soviet Union, but that's beside the public, you know, realm of permissible. But the war memory is all about the heroic past. It is a shared traumatic experience that brings it into the Soviet fold, as well as the fact that Belarus contributed the largest partisan movement in the war, which is factually accurate, pro-Soviet partisans, that is. And Belarus, you know, in that sense, was very much part of the Soviet war effort. So all of that forms the sort of the past, the usable past that binds Belarus to the Soviet fold, to the Soviet state. But it's not just about the past, because, you know, you need to have something to look forward to. And this is where modernization comes through. We've overcome that, we've moved forward, and then some, and look at us. And this is a showcase of what Soviet modernization can achieve and can do against all odds, such as the war, overcoming trauma, and so on. But in all of that, there's a very strong national element. These are Belarusian traumas, these are Belarusian contributions to the war. And indeed, the partisan movement ethnically was majority Belarusians, you know, unlike some other places. And the Soviet achievements of post-war progress are also Belarusian. You know, Belarusian people pulled themselves by the bust shoestrings out of the marshes. You know, this is the rhetoric that's used over and over and over again. And they're talented and they're hardworking and they're a people. And I think that's something that had an impact and produced, you know, a lot of what we have today. Natalya, in terms of your question, I need to do more research into how the negotiation of resources was, in what terms it was coached with Moscow. But my sense, it is political. It's not just particular industries. It can't be everything, right? So some industries, some sectors have to be chosen. They're often chosen on the basis of what is there. So the oil is discovered, so chemistry begins, you know, its heyday. There was some chemical research and production in Belarus in the 1930s, but mostly in, you know, peat related, so the marshes and woods, and wasn't very much in terms of scale. And in the 1960s, it suddenly got, but that's because they have oil to play with. A lot of the investment, a lot of the economic decisions are made by the politicians, by the Central Committee, and Masharov takes a real lead on that in the 1960s and beyond, because he's a believer in science. You know, a personal factor comes into place. He's a believer in science. He bargains successfully, partly because of, you know, Belarusian kind of reputation as the partisan republic that deserves all that, investments come in, and sometimes this is on the basis of achievements in other sectors of economy. For example, in 1973, Belarus gets a lot of state bonuses and you know, financial monetary awards, as well as the various banners and orders for its agricultural production. It overfulfills the plan and then some, and Moscow is you know, appreciative, and Belarus gets whatever the banner of socialist labor in that year. This is the Republic, and in exchange they ask for a metro to be built in Minsk. It's a big privilege. You need to have Moscow's permission, but sort of on the back of these successes, they say, well, how about it? And they get it. You know, Minsk becomes the 9th city in the Soviet Union to be given permission to have a metro, which they're very proud of. So.
Just to briefly gate crash the Third Republic debate, which is getting exciting. In all things Komsomol related, and with Natalya, it's Belarus which takes third place in terms of the numbers sent, the things built, and so on. Belarus is pretty clear in third in that respect. In terms of the kind of inspiration of Narodniki and so on, I've not really seen anything much to suggest this. It seems unlikely in the 50s and 60s especially, but you know, with this kind of slightly more backwards looking turn that we see in culture in the late 60s and 70s and so on, I suspect if I looked hard enough, I might be able to find more sort of embrace of the pre-revolutionary period in that respect. What you're more likely to see, even though there's a certain leap that has to be made, is connections to the war. So this is about, sometimes it's creating memorials, I mean, all kinds of fields. And this generally is part of a sort of a steadily more militaristic kind of vibe in Komsomol work with young people across the 60s and 70s under Pavlov especially. But yeah, there's much more talk of kind of fathers and grandfathers than going any further back than that, in my experience.
Yeah, well, concerning, you know, Mikhail, it's pretty easy because I think Semichastny was very experienced coup maker. You know, he was the only one who could technically organize a successful coup against the Soviet dictator in Soviet history. You know, so that's it. He was replaced by Andropov. Who will send Shelepin? He was experienced as well in these power circles. Who will send somebody to Mr. Nobody at that time? You know, that lacks any logic. They didn't, if you go to the October plenum 64, they didn't trust Mikhail.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was survivor from Ilyich to Ilyich, as it was called.
Yeah, he was the
Okay,
leader.
and he betrayed Khrushchev the way only Semichastny and the closer circle knew. They didn't have respect and trust in him. Now, all the narrative goes to the support from below, Komsomol support, which means the Komsomol generation would support a potential leader, Shelepin. Why suddenly include Mikhail, who was pretty far from, you know, despite, or, you know, so pretty far from Komsomol order? It lacks any logic whatsoever. And first of all, there is no evidence for that. If the son included whatever he might have included into the memoirs, he should specify who approached him, when and how. It was somebody approached me. And in general, and to conclude this, I am pretty skeptical to all testimonies of children of these, you know, leaders. Because if you go, with all respect, I don't know, many people have worked, you know, with Sergei Khrushchev, for example, recollections and so on and so on. It looks like, well, all the respect, you know, I respect him. He was a nice man and so on, but it was not the way, you know, the system worked. Sergei Khrushchev was not first advisor of his father, especially not in his late 20s. Okay, it's nonsense. And now the constructions in Sergei Khrushchev's, for example, books about the Khrushchev era are wrong. Sorry, but it's not about defending Semichastny, not at all. He was far from innocent. Shelepin, they are not my, you know, cup of tea. But on the other hand, to be precise, just to understand the logic of the system, it's worth asking these questions. By the way, we discussed coups with Semichastny pretty extensively because of course, 1991, when the Soviet television showed a documentary, an interview with Semichastny at the day the GKCHP was happening, you know, so he was suddenly, you know, asked about the relevance of that and so on as a retired man. And of course, 1964, because he told me, you know, there is a film, Seriev Archive.
Yeah.
And it's the biggest bullshit I have ever seen. You know, he told me, and I said, of course, because they portray you in negative light, of course. So I understand. No, not because of that. But he said, do you think the structure was that stupid? That I could take 2 glasses of vodka with Malimonovsky and tell him, come on, Rodion, give me some tanks and we will conquer Kremlin? Do you think that system was that stupid? And don't forget that, for example, Andropov, as a former chairman of the KGB for 15 years, was afraid of meeting Gorbachev in their dachas because it could have been monitored.
Yeah.
Okay, so to make it that primitive, I have no respect to the Soviet system, like, you know, emotional, but on the other hand, to make it this primitive does not make us, you know, more clever.
Yeah.
So from this point of view, I'm approaching all this information. I'm not defending, you know, my source, which happened to be Semechastny. But I think that has an internal logic.
We have a lot more hands that were up, so forgive it in 15 minutes. And 15 minutes.
Sorry for that.
Give the order I'm going into. Professor Sunin?
So as an older white male, I know this has been a largely genderless conference so far. And I was very taken by the text you put up about how many peasant women spinning on wheels suddenly now are working in the textile industry. So labor, you know, is also gendered, right? And it seemed to me that both gender and peasant life, and to some degree females, are coded as backward, and that modernization is coded as masculine and machines, right, and strength of some kind. I guess my question is, does that sound right to you? And you have other things. And the second question partly is, ethnicity also seems coded backward. So I love your idea of a civic identity, but what's actually happening with teaching Belarusian as a language? And, you know, is this all been related to dance groups in museums and ethnographic costumes? Or is there a way in which what's specifically cultural is also integrated?
Hold that thought. Nikolai,
Question, Natalya. The first, my question about the people the program which was in the Belarus, especially the East Belarus, with the peasants youth who have no job in their own villages, and then they try to decide this program to send the seminar, the big groups of the youth, and then in my mind used these opportunities to development the big industry, the big cities where involved a lot of the working hands to big industry projects. How you can see that through governance and so on, because I know that just. The second, my question is about the protest in the Belarusian language, which was in the Leeds and some other cities in the second half of the 60s, when these peasants demand from the power give more opportunity to study Russian language, like more perspective language. It's a unique case which I know from those. And the third, my questions will be about the political reform of the center, like the Samarkose, lately about the Khazayственная reform or the Khazayственная reform, how the Belarus Republicans or regionals power use these opportunities.
all questions for Natalya.
Lucky me.
Answer them briefly.
Sure. Gender in modernization. Yes, I mean, we know that you know, heavy industry is male in the Soviet Union. Women's roles are, as that indicates, textile industry. So they're part of it, modernization, but within specific feminized sectors of the economy. Occasionally, you see examples in the press of women being, you know, overachievers in sectors that are not traditionally female, so in heavy industry and so on. And they're presented as kind of evidence of gender equality, but I think those are, those are particularly visible because unusual tends to be genderfied along the familiar lines. So yeah. Ethnic elements. Well, the big, and that sort of chimes, I think, with your Nikolai question about protest, about language. Usually it's the sort of the slow death of Belarusian language in the public sphere that is seen as the death toll of Belarusian national identity. And I think that story is more complex than that, because even though it is absolutely the case that more and more Belarusians who are urban residents as a result of post-war rural urban migration, which in Belarus is spectacular. I mean, and in that sense, Belarus again overachieves in the Soviet Union trends, especially after the war, not just from East Belarus, but Western Belarus, because they're just escaping poverty, the awful conditions in the countryside. But that continues on, and they don't necessarily all stay in the republics. There's a lot of inter-republican migration going out. Belarusians leave Belarus, and other republican sort of ethnic groups come back in, well, no, so not come back, but come in, because they have better education. It was amazing how many non-Belarusians and even non-Russians were working on those first oil wells in Belarus. When they were discovered, because Belarusians didn't have the expertise. So they had to bring, Ingush, possibly Armenians, all kinds of, not even Russian ethnicity that were working on these projects. So there's a lot of that. But in the press, it's often presented strangely Belarusian achievements and Belarusian national sort of achievement. In terms of ethnicity, yes, the language is in decline in schools. Universities are Russified, but there's a lot of pushback from the national intelligentsia on this. They're quite vocal, and they, unlike the former peasants who are now workers who want their children to get education and therefore demand that their kids get schooling in Russian so that they could go up the social ladder, national intelligentsia is pushing back and is constantly telling the authorities, the local authorities, that we can't let the language die, because then we die as a nation. And while schooling doesn't change, perhaps Masharov thinks that's too dangerous after Latvia and Azerbaijan in 1959, but he does, on his watch, there's investment in publishing in Belarusian languages. The Belarusian literature is supported beyond reasonable sometimes. And Belarusian writers are on first name terms with Masharov, that he fosters personal relations with them. Of course, there's culture that's portrayed as ethnic Belarusian on television, in various public events, festivals, and so on. And children do study Belarusian literature in school, albeit in a very abridged version. So the ethnic element, but Belarusians are constantly reminded they're a nation. They're an ethnic nation. There's emphasis on history, pre-revolutionary history. I mean, I could go into that because I've just written an article on that, but we probably don't have time. So
I want to try and squeeze in two last questions if we can. Barbara, Suzanne had a hand up at the very, very beginning.
I try to be brief, just for all, because you were asking so many questions, and maybe Alex Oberländer, who's doing research in labor, and it might be good to get into exchange with her. I can give you her email address, and then I think a lot of your questions have been treated by Christopher Ward in his book on Brezhnev's Folly.
Some of them.
You know that, yeah. Okay, so yes, I leave it with that. To Thomas, I agree, and Brezhnev was clever, much cleverer than all the others. So don't go into detail. The question is for Natalya again. Sorry, I was wondering, in your larger narrative, how you will treat Masharov and Belarus as an example for the whole, or as an exception, or are you going to have a hierarchy of republics?
Okay, so I have a question to Natalya as well. So first of all, I'm very happy that you took this topic, because a few years ago I started to look to literature, to
find out about Belarus, about modernization of Belarus, and I found nothing, almost nothing, because perhaps Bonn, German historian about Minsk, some literature about Minsk, and I think Joffe about political some issues, and that's it. That's it. So we demanding is very high for this modernization for research. But you know, you didn't mention Kirill Mazurov. All benefits goes to Masharov only. So Kirill Mazurov was a real patron of Belarus. So he helped. He was the deputy chair of Council of Ministers. Of course, he supported very much the Belarus, the development of Belarus, of course. And the second thing is that just we can look at different models of modernization. And perhaps we can take for comparison Lithuanian model. And you know, perhaps Pilotovich. Pilotovich was secretary, Central Committee of Secretary in Belarus. And he introduced a very interesting program, I think in 1965, that development of small cities. At least he spoke about that. Yeah? So and as Masharov was just silent about this, and he didn't express his opinion. And you know, we have different types of modernization, and we have Lithuanian modernization. It means development of small cities like Lida, like Grodno. Yeah. So, but not Minsk. And the development of Minsk meant Russification of republic. So, and I think we should pay attention to this conditions, to the circumstances as well.
Okay. Would you like all three of you to respond?
I could just say thank you.
Thank you.
Me too.
Natalya?
Maybe I should stick to thinking about yes, Mazur, I didn't mean to say that it was just Masharov. It was on his watch that all these come, you know, that they turn the key and they start. But of course, you know, who was there for 2 decades before Mazurov. When Mazurov moves up to Moscow, Belarus gets a powerful patron, but he doesn't stick at the top for long. He falls out with Brezhnev, partly because I think he's associated with Kosygin primarily. And when Kosygin begins to fall out with Brezhnev, that impacts Mazurov, and then it impacts Belarus. But Mazurov is very important, and in all kinds of ways, and absolutely, you know, I'm not forgotten about him. Masharov isn't responsible for everything. He delegates, Pilotovich is one of those to whom he delegates. Minsk could not be developed as a small city because it's not. They want it to be a large city, a major city. Because it has so many educational institutions, because the party speaks Russian and the party is in Minsk, it is a Russian city. And those who come to live there, as Nikolai pointed out, push, sometimes much to the chagrin of the local party leaders, like Brzezinski, for example, they want more Russian. And there is a sense in sort of within some circles of Belarusian political establishment that, you know, maybe we shouldn't go all that way. But, you know, Masharov himself as a kind of personal example of that transition is quite spectacular. I mean, he epitomizes a lot of changes that Belarus undergoes. He travels from the village to the city. He becomes, you know, goes from a peasant to the very top of social mobility ladder in Belarus. In the process, he drops Russian. When he was a young lad, when he was a kid, when he was teaching before the war physics and math in a school, he spoke Belarusian. He still remembered it in the 1960s and 70s, but apparently spoke with such a heavy accent that his daughter advised him not to attempt it anymore in public. He completely remodeled himself as a you know, Soviet politician, a Russian speaking, and you know, the rest followed. And Mazurov mentions that in 1953, when they tried to get rid of Patolichev in that plenum, he says, had we all been speaking Russian, I mean Belarusian, maybe people in the Republic would be speaking Belarusian more willingly and eagerly. But that's 1953. By 1965, Mazurov's Russian is perfect as well.
Thank you. Conference organizers encourage me, so there's two more questions.
No, only one.
One.
Let that die now, yeah.
Okay.
Robert, but maybe it's not so much question as a kind of statement.
Okay.
Your topic is very interesting. I for some time I'm thinking about that one of my next projects should be about commercialization of Komsomol. Because really, if you see, for example, of lists of Latvian millionaires in 90s, a lot of them are former Komsomol nomenclatura people. There are such persons as Grigory Luchansky. Everybody could find in Google about him, who was commander of Latvian student construction team at the end of 19 and beginning of 70s, and afterwards he was vice rector of Latvian University. Afterwards he served several years at Perm Oblast on Chimia, if you know what this means. And at the beginning of 90s, when Gorbachev visited Latvia, he was deputy of director of agrarian enterprise Adaži, and Gorbachev granted for Adaži as the first economic unit in the Soviet Union a right to trade directly with the West, and so Luchansky started to became billionaire, and so on. So it's very interesting, really. And I suppose, and of course, there's such problem. Of course, there was such ideological discourse and patriotic initiatives and so on. But on the other hand, there is still, at least starting with 70s, really practical needs, practical interests from grassroots level. It's very interesting to have money, and they had to have people who were able to organize this process. Like Luchansky, who in Altai, he yes, they didn't have cement. He gave several tons of material from somewhere. They didn't have a steel. He went to Chernyshova and get the steel and so on and so on. So I suppose how do you think when it started really this when this I suppose in my opinion in Khrushchev times it was rather traditional Soviet politics of using of youth enthusiasm and so on, but not giving much benefits for those people who really worked and so on. In the Brezhnev's times, it started really on some kind of great commercial activities and real interests of on grassroots level. How do you think when it started and what is your opinion about this commercial aspect? Komsomol, a school of capitalism.
That's the title of your book.
Yeah, I wouldn't go quite so far as school of capitalism, but I think there are signs by the end of the 50s, to be honest. So there is in all the Komsomol literature, one of the first things that you'll be told at the Komsomol archive, for example, in the late 50s, the Komsomol stops relying on party money and becomes self-sustaining financially. we also see at that stage the Komsomol kind of newspaper portfolio is growing massively, the circulation and so on. And they're actively pushing for this because there's a shortage of paper in the country. So they really have to kind of lean on ministries to be allowed to increase circulation. And it's going up in a huge way. Another example would be the Sputnik Youth Travel Agency. This kind of starts out as, again, as a sort of a, fraternal thing to get Soviet youth and foreigners more broadly interacting. But it starts making money fairly quickly. They drop the notion that, it's on an equal basis and no money changes hands fairly quickly. The cash registers are tinging. And then we know from, for example, Sergei Zhuk, who talks about the kind of Komsomol discos by the 70s and so on, that, they're first and foremost, they like the money that this brings in, same as screening Western movies and that kind of stuff. So I think it's fate, but I think you can see a start to this probably around the end of the 50s, although there is no sort of, firing gun starter when it kicks off. I think it gets steadily.
Komsomol disco tonight.
If you tell me where it is, I'll be there.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank all three speakers for the excellent papers.
Right, thanks for a great first day. So now we have an hour and 20 minutes before we have dinner at the Boffy restaurant, where we're upstairs under my name.